It is usual to witness the protagonist of a popular romantic comedy pursuing and continuously wooing the object of his passion, frequently in ways that would be called stalking in real life. This is a common occurrence in many famous romantic comedies. On television, these activities are portrayed as cute and hilarious, and the protagonist ultimately succeeds in winning the love and affection of the person he has selected to be his companion. This portrayal, on the other hand, is a long cry from reality, where an action of this nature is not only undesirable, but also has the potential to result in disastrous consequences. This gap is cruelly brought to light by the case of Celeste Manno, which demonstrates how real-life stalking may develop into a nightmare. On November 30th, 1997, Celeste Christa Manno was born in the northeastern segment of Melbourne, which is located in the state of Victoria, Australia. She grew up alongside her older brother Alessandro. She was the youngest of two children born to Aggie DeMauro and Tony Monroe. She was the younger of the two grandchildren. In spite of the fact that Celeste's father abandoned the family while she was still a little child, her family was always there to provide her with love and support throughout her childhood. In addition to excelling in academics, sports, and dancing, Celeste was a child who was full of life and activity. She had lofty goals for her future and was the captain of the cheerleading team at her school. She was also enthusiastic about her future. In the beginning, she had the goal of becoming a lawyer, so she enrolled at the prestigious University of Melbourne, where she studied both criminal and civil law. In spite of this, she eventually moved her attention to advertising and marketing since she found law to be uninspiring. During the year 2018, Celeste started working for a prominent e-commerce company, where she quickly climbed the professional ladder thanks to her intelligence, initiative, and organizational skills. She began her career as an employee in a call center, and within a span of 2 years, she rose through the ranks to become the head of an entire department. Her coworkers admired her for her impressive level of expertise and dedication. The beginning of Celeste's problems came when she attracted the attention of a coworker named Louis Sacco, who was over 16 years her senior during that time. Almost immediately after she started working for the company, Louis began to take a deep interest in her. In spite of the fact that he was a quiet and unsociable person, he made numerous attempts to ask her out. Despite the fact that she was courteous and kind-hearted, Celeste consistently rebuffed his approaches with courtesy, thinking that he would ultimately lose interest. On the other hand, Louis misunderstood Celeste's civility and turned it into a challenge. He mistook her professionalism and generosity for signs that she was simply trying to be difficult to get, and as a result, he became increasingly obsessed with her. As a result of his continuous and awkward attempts to win her over, Celeste found herself experiencing annoyance and discomfort. She made an effort to keep her calm and hoped that he would eventually move on from their relationship. The unfortunate reality is that Louis' obsession only became stronger, which finally led to a chain of events that would culminate in a tragic turn of events. In a short amount of time, Louis Sacco's fascination with Celeste Manno developed into an unhealthy dependency on her. Louis continued to make efforts towards Celeste, thinking that her compassion indicated a deeper interest in him, despite the fact that she politely declined his advances. As his behavior became more intrusive and inappropriate, he made numerous attempts to ask her out and engage her in conversation. His behavior became increasingly unacceptable. Celeste made an effort to have a respectful and professional approach at all times, and she made an effort to discourage him without causing him any irritation. She thought that her refusals, which were forceful but polite, would finally convince him to change his mind. On the other hand, Louis believed that Celeste was using her polite dismissals as a game or a challenge, and he believed that she was simply trying to be difficult to get. His preoccupation became more strong, and others who were around him became more aware of it. It was at this point that the issue reached a turning point. Louis, who was preoccupied with his obsession, started disregarding his professional responsibilities. Because of his precipitous decline in productivity, he was ultimately terminated from his position in the fall of 2019 after having been given multiple warnings. The termination of Louis' employment ought to have been a source of relief for Celeste. Nevertheless, it instead signaled the beginning of a phase that was more problematic. On his last day, she made the mistake of wishing him luck and touching him on the shoulder as she was escorting him out of the building. This act was misunderstood by Louis as an indication that Celeste had more profound affections for him, which bolstered his irrational notion that the two of them might be together now that he was no longer under her authority. Following his dismissal from his position, Louis's preoccupation with Celeste took on a more concerning tone. It was his intention to maintain communication with her by establishing various social media profiles and sending her friend requests and messages. In the beginning, Celeste granted one of these requests in the hope that it would appease him. However, when he started assaulting her with continuous requests to meet, she blocked him. Celeste was compelled to modify her privacy settings in order to restrict Louis' access to her photos and remarks since he persistently created new profiles, praising her appearance and writing comments on her photographs. The harassment that Louis was committing quickly increased to include phone calls and text messages. At first, he used unknown numbers to send love poems and messages, but later on, he shifted his focus to contain content that was more forceful and explicit. While Celeste made an effort to block each new number, Louis was always able to find a method to get in touch with her. She went so far as to change her phone number, only for Louis to find out about the new number and proceed with his constant harassment. Upon coming to the realization that Louis was now physically following her as well, Celeste started to feel concerned about her own safety. In spite of the fact that she initially discounted these sightings as psychosis, she did observe his automobile parked near her place of employment, and she also caught a glimpse of him near her house. It was then that she made the decision to seek protection from the police as it became apparent that Louis was, in fact, following her. Celeste's initial attempt to seek assistance from the authorities was met with a lack of interest on their part. Her objections were disregarded by the cops, who argued that Louis had not committed any illegal act by sending messages or writing poems. They did not show any compassion for her concerns and indicated that she should only come back if a physical crime was committed instead. Celeste was left feeling vulnerable and unsupported as a result of this inadequate response, which occurred while Louis's abuse continued unhampered. A restraining order against Louis Sacco was ultimately secured by Celeste Manno in August of 2020 after she had been subjected to persistent harassment for several months. She experienced a momentary sense of comfort as a result of this successful legal action. After a few weeks, it appeared as though Louis had complied with the order. He vanished from her sight and stopped engaging in actions that were considered to be stalking. According to Celeste, the legal action had finally put an end to her agony, and she felt a sense of freedom that she had been waiting for a very long time. Nevertheless, this brief reprieve was only temporary. After a period of less than 1 month, Louis resumed his harassing behavior, but this time he did so in a more clandestine manner. He generated new phone numbers and sent messages to Celeste, asking with her to rescind the restraining order and demanding that she do so, alleging that it interfered with their purported relationship. Celeste quickly reported these new incidences to the authorities as she became aware of the violation of the restraining order for the individual. When she complained to law enforcement this time, they took her concerns more seriously. A fine was issued to Louis, and he was cautioned that any additional infractions would result in more severe repercussions, including the possibility of jail time. Despite the fact that this was the situation, the response from the police was not adequate enough to provide Celeste with the comprehensive protection that she requested. As a result of the constraints imposed by the legal system and the previous indifference displayed by the police, she was left with a persistent sense of vulnerability. Through his unwavering determination, the stalker demonstrated that he was not easily dissuaded from continuing his unlawful activities. During the month of September in the year 2020, Celeste began a romantic relationship with Chris Ridsdale, a young guy who offered her the happiness and security that she had been looking for. Chris made an attempt to offer Celeste assistance and protection because she was aware of the misery that was caused by her former coworker. Celeste was the recipient of an effort by Chris. As the couple's relationship rapidly developed into a serious one, Celeste had a sense of optimism for the first time in a number of months during this time period. Celeste and Chris were able to capture the happiness and connection that they experienced by shooting a photo together on one of their dates while they were actually together. There was a time when Celeste wanted to let her friends and family know about the significance of her new connection, and she did so by posting the photo on her social media profile. She acted in this manner because she desired to have them experience the same joy that she had. Chris shared the picture with his pals, demonstrating not only his love for Celeste, but also his dedication to her. The regrettable truth is that the public declaration of their relationship had tremendously bad ramifications. This is a reality that cannot be avoided. During the course of Louis Sacco's continued and relentless monitoring of Celeste's internet presence, the photograph was discovered by him. His already unstable mentality was triggered by this, which prompted him to find himself in a condition of rage and despair. He seen this as the final rejection, and it was a catalyst for his mental instability. The understanding that Celeste was with another man was enough to push him over the edge, and it was this realization that caused him to conduct actions that were severe and brutal. As a consequence of this convergence of events, which was fueled by Louis's preoccupation and made even more severe by the social media post, the stage was prepared for the awful and tragic encounter that would take place in a short period of time. The preventative steps that Celeste had taken turned out to be insufficient against a stalker who was so deeply embedded in his illusions and so determined on possessing her at any cost. Both of these characteristics were present in the stalker. The tragic culmination of Louis Sacco's obsessive behavior occurred on the evening of November 16, 2020. This event was a sad finale of his behavior. Throughout 4 in the morning, Aggie, Celeste's mother, was abruptly jerked awake by the sound of glass smashed throughout the home. This jolted her awake from her sleep. Almost immediately after Aggie started to experience dizziness, she became aware that the sounds were coming from within their home. She was gripped with dread as she walked to Celeste's room and discovered an intruder escaped through a window that had been damaged. She was unable to contain her shock. In the pool of blood that Aggie discovered her daughter lying in, she discovered that she was covered in cuts and small bits of glass. Aggie was only able to look at her daughter with the light that was available to her. Celeste was in a state of shock, to the point where she was having difficulty breathing, and her eyes were hanging open. At that very moment, Aggie immediately dialed the number for emergency services and made an effort to stop the blood that was pouring from the many wounds that her daughter was suffering from. Despite her efforts and the rapid arrival of the paramedics, it was well past the point where there was no turning back into a situation. The unfortunate news is that Celeste Manno did not make it through her injuries and passed away before an ambulance could take her to the hospital. Celeste had been stabbed more than 20 times, with the fatal blow having reached her heart, according to the report that was made by the medical examiner after some time had elapsed. Immediately following the discovery of Celeste's body, the authorities initiated their investigation into the homicide immediately. One of the bloody fingerprints and DNA evidence that was found at the scene was located on a fence that the culprit had climbed over while attempting to flee. There were a substantial number of bloody fingerprints and DNA evidence discovered at the scene. It was clear that the offender had a deeply personal motivation, as evidenced by the severity of the attack as well as the manner in which it was carried out. The members of Celeste's family invariably pointed the finger of blame at Louis Sacco, the enamored former coworker who had harassed her for more than a year. This was in response to the query of whether or not Celeste had any rivals. The decision to make an arrest of Louis Sacco today was made by the police after taking into consideration the evidence as well as the testimonies provided by the witnesses. At the beginning, Louis vehemently denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that he loved Celeste and would never do anything to damage her. He also stated that he would never hurt her. In spite of this, the forensic evidence that was produced against him was extremely strong. After further investigation, it was discovered that he had purchased a huge knife and a hammer from a nearby hardware store the evening before the murder would take place. It was revealed that his bloody fingerprints were identical to those that were found at the location where the crime took place. During the course of the surveillance footage, Louis was seen paying for the things that would later be utilized in the assault that ultimately led to his murder at the checkout counter. Soon after Louis was presented with this evidence that could not be disputed, his claims of innocence began to fall apart in a very short amount of time. A strong picture of premeditation and violent fixation on his part was built by his actions in the days leading up to the murder, in concert with the physical evidence that linked him to the location of the murder. Although Louis Sacco originally disputed the charges, it was inevitable that he would be the primary suspect in the heinous murder of Celeste Manno. This was the case despite the fact that he initially denied the allegations. The tragic culmination of Louis Sacco's obsessive behavior occurred on the evening of November 16, 2020. This event was a sad finale of his behavior. Throughout 4 a.m, Aggie, Celeste's mother, was abruptly jerked awake by the sound of glass smashed throughout the home. This jolted her awake from her sleep. Almost immediately after Aggie started to experience dizziness, she became aware that the sounds were coming from within their home. She was gripped with dread as she walked to Celeste's room and discovered an intruder escaped through a window that had been damaged. She was unable to contain her shock. In the pool of blood that Aggie discovered her daughter lying in, she discovered that she was covered in cuts and small bits of glass. Aggie was only able to look at her daughter with the light that was available to her. Celeste was in a state of shock, to the point where she was having difficulty breathing and her eyes were hanging open. At that very moment, Aggie immediately dialed the number for emergency services and made an effort to stop the blood that was pouring from the many wounds that her daughter was suffering from. Despite her efforts and the rapid arrival of the paramedics, it was well past the point where there was no turning back into a situation. The unfortunate news is that Celeste Manno did not make it through her injuries and passed away before an ambulance could take her to the hospital. Celeste had been stabbed more than 20 times, with the fatal blow having reached her heart, according to the report that was made by the medical examiner after some time had elapsed. Immediately following the discovery of Celeste's body, the authorities initiated their investigation into the homicide immediately. One of the bloody fingerprints and DNA evidence that was found at the scene was located on a fence that the culprit had climbed over while attempting to flee. There were a substantial number of bloody fingerprints and DNA evidence discovered at the scene. It was clear that the offender had a deeply personal motivation, as evidenced by the severity of the attack as well as the manner in which it was carried out. The members of Celeste's family invariably pointed the finger of blame at Louis Sacco, the enamored former coworker who had harassed her for more than a year. This was in response to the query of whether or not Celeste had any rivals. In light of the evidence and the statements made by the witnesses, the police made the decision to make an arrest of Louis Sacco today. At first, Louis fiercely denied any involvement in the crime, stating that he loved Celeste and would never do anything to hurt her. Despite this, the forensic evidence that was presented against him was tremendous. Further inquiry revealed that he had acquired a large knife and a hammer from a local hardware store the evening before the murder. His bloody fingerprints were determined to be identical to those that were discovered at the site. In the surveillance film, Louis was seen paying for the items that would ultimately be used in the attack that resulted in his death at the checkout counter. When Louis was confronted with this proof that could not be refuted, his assertions of innocence swiftly disintegrated. His activities in the days leading up to the murder, in conjunction with the physical evidence that linked him to the site, formed a strong picture of premeditation and violent obsession on his part. The fate of Louis Sacco was predetermined as the major suspect in the horrible murder of Celeste Manno, despite the fact that he initially denied the allegations. Psychiatric professionals, on the other hand, came to the conclusion that Sacco, despite the fact that he did have problems with his mental health, was fully conscious of his conduct at the time of the crime. The fact that he had painstakingly planned the attack is evidence that it was not an act of impulsive behavior motivated by insanity, but rather premeditation. This decision considerably undermined the defense's plea for leniency on the basis that the defendant's mental health was a concern. During the trial, which took place in the fall of 2023, Sacco admitted his guilt, but insisted that he had no intention of killing Celeste and that he had simply planned to gain her affection. However, the jurors did not appear to be swayed by his assertions. A unanimous guilty decision was reached as a result of the overwhelming evidence providing evidence of his purposeful and premeditated actions. The maximum penalty for Sacco was 36 years in jail, with the prospect of release only being granted after he had served 30 years. Aggie DeMauro, Celeste's mother, embarked on a campaign to reform legislation in order to better protect victims of stalking after her daughter's untimely murder. She put out a proposal known as Celeste's Law, which sought to establish criminal culpability for stalking through the use of social media platforms, text messages, and emails. Aggie collaborated with attorneys and activist organizations to draft more than 40 recommendations and revisions, and she worked relentlessly on this project. The situation involving Celeste Manno highlights the sharp contrast between the media's frequently romanticized portrayal of the concept of relentless pursuit and the implications that stalking actually has in terms of individuals' lives. The tragic conclusion that befell Celeste brings to light the urgent requirement for improved legislative protections against stalking, particularly in this day and age of digital technology. The proposed legislative amendments, such as Celeste's Law, are an essential step toward averting future tragedies that are comparable to those that have occurred in the past. However, the laws that are already in place do not provide sufficient protection. The narrative of Celeste serves as a powerful reminder of the perils associated with fixation and the pressing requirement for comprehensive safeguards to prevent persons from being harassed and stalked. Thank you for watching. I recommend our other crime videos.